How did you become a philosopher? Or do you even call yourself a philosopher?
That, well, it's funny that you should start with that question, Ellery. What a coincidence. I have my recent book right here, the Philosopher's New Clothes. The introduction begins, philosophers in America find it awkward when strangers ask, what do you do? Philosophers, at least the ones I know in this country, almost worry that it's too arrogant to say they're philosophers. And they respond with all sorts of stratagems. Sometimes they just obsessively, you're stuck on an airplane. Someone asks, what do you do? And you obsessively focus on what the stranger does so that you don't have to get around to this subject. A friend of mine who used to teach logic as part of his job would say, I'm a logician, which usually had the nice advantage that since nobody was interested in logic at all, that ended the conversation. Unfortunately, he has an extremely heavy Scottish accent, and so people would sometimes think he was saying he was a magician, and would he do some tricks, and then that ruined that, because even being a philosopher is better than being a magician. But why should the title or the name philosopher inspire that kind of unease? Is a good question. And I think part of it has to do with the fact that in a way that's not trivial, everybody philosophizes. That doesn't mean everyone's a philosopher, but if philosophers did not do something like what everybody does sometimes, it would be hard to justify the subject in the first place. And for the same reason, philosophy both does and doesn't belong in the academy, in an institution of higher learning. And I think the ambivalence there has to do with why it seems awkward to say, I'm a philosopher. I started college as a pre-med student, and I needed one more course, and my poor father said, take one philosophy course, it'll open your mind. And I took one philosophy course, and well, it had quite a waking effect. But, well, more than that, I can remember thinking when I was in philosophy class that I was in a place for the first time that had oxygen, as if I had been breathing it all my life but couldn't find it. And philosophy was so suited to what I thought I was doing all the time anyway, that it was really only a matter of months before I abandoned any idea of going to medical school.
Was your dad displeased or pleased?
He was extremely disappointed.
So it's been questioned of Nietzsche himself. Was he a psychologist or a philosopher, which seems to apply a little bit to that dichotomy between the physician and the philosopher?
It was philosophers really who first made the analogy between the body as what doctors care for and the soul as what philosophers ought to care for. Well, if you've got that analogy going, you're already talking about some kind of healing. In Nietzsche's case, maybe in Nietzsche's case we come back to the question of how he was employed. Because Nietzsche is one of these modern philosophers who's not exactly a philosophy professor. And that's true of very influential thinkers. Karl Marx was not a professor. Kierkegaard was not a professor. And even before them, Descartes was a military man. Spinoza was a lens grinder. So we worry in some of their cases, are they really philosophers, given that they're not professors? And yet one side of that worry has to be comical. I mean, it can only exist comically. The lady spends the night in the pound. I forget why. And another dog is showing her around. And they see this big, lanky hound with a Russian accent who says something existential. I don't know. It's something like, "Isn't all life a dog pound, really?" And the dog who's showing Lady around says, "Oh, Boris is a philosopher." And Sabina, when we were watching this, laughed and she said, "Oh, that's so silly. Dogs don't have jobs." So, well, she was just a little, she thought philosophy was just a job. The fact that we find that funny, as opposed to, you know, if a dog was an accountant, and you'd say dogs don't have jobs, not a joke at all. The fact that we find it funny for philosophy to be a job reflects some of the anxiety on our minds when we say something like, Nietzsche was not really a philosopher, or Marx was not a philosopher. I'm not saying you can't classify them that way. I guess I'm saying that for many philosophers who are worth reading, the question remains active. Do we want to classify them as philosophers, and what's the purpose of classifying them that way?
We should all be philosophers.
Yes, I don't know if anyone would say we should all be philosophers full time.
No.
But